Hello everybody. So I have notes with me today because I have been trying to hone what I want to say all day, and I'm still not sure I'm going to be able to do it, but I'll take a stab at it. So I mentioned in a previous video that I wanted to talk at some point about the Hush Tarot, one of my favorite decks of all time, and the artwork of Arthur Rackham. Connecting this deck with artistic traditions could literally, like, you could do that for the whole entire Gilded Age kind of art style in general, or art school of thought in general. You could do it with any of the golden age of British book illustration artists. There's definitely similar connections to be made between this deck and things like Edmund Dulock's work and so on, but a lot of these people all would have been functioning within the same set of circles anyway, exploring similar concepts, or diverging on important points that you could explore. So the entire point with this whole Connect the Deck series as a whole anyway is that it's kind of going down the rabbit hole. Like, the entire point is that you have decks at your disposal, and there is so much to explore that is purposefully put into these decks. And these videos really are just essentially me kind of talking about something I get excited about. It's not even from a perspective of expertise. So anyway, Hush Tarot and the artwork of Arthur Rackham. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Arthur Rackham specifically. The golden age of British book illustration would have been roughly like 1890s to end of World War I, right? And the really interesting thing about the associations we make with the art of that time period, and then also art that's inspired by it or that is reminiscent of it, is something that we often talk about is color choices. Moody color choices, somber color choices, atmospheric, autumnal, lots of words that we like to use for certain types, especially of fantasy art or art that reminds us of storybooks or fairy tales, will include these sorts of color choices. And one of the reasons that's actually the case, or really, really relevant, is because, for example, Arthur Rackham is a very, very famous example. He would have been at the forefront of this. At the time period in which his career was experiencing its heyday, and a lot of the stuff that he was producing was considered to have popular appeal, was taking hold, was influencing people, we have really dramatic advances in letterpress printing being able to achieve much more subtle and varied colors in the production of books and so on. The emphasis, I think, especially towards the later half of the later part of the 19th century, so the end of the Victorian era, would have been, illustrated books produced as high quality items presented as Christmas gifts kind of thing, found in nice materials, signed, kind of deluxe editions, if you follow me. There also then would have been an emphasis on slightly cheaper production, but more wider distribution. So something like a quarto version, which refers to, by the ways the pages are folded and cut in the printing process, and that also loosely corresponds to book sizes and production value and so on, historically. And then for apparently later on, particularly in Arthur Rackham's time period or career, really, really popular works would have then been produced in octavo format and so on. So like the emphasis in all of this printing and storybooks and all of that is getting things out to people in this sort of very, very tactile way, and having different ways of accessing that material. So anyway, around this time you would have had a lot of advancements happening with trichromatic color printing for letterpress printed books and so on. And I'll link articles that I have found down below that kind of explain this in terms that actually make sense. But since I'm really bad at talking about anything sciencey, math-y, or even highly technical, to my understanding, the basics of this is that it relies on color theory. You have the three sort of sets of three primary colors, the ways in which you layer different printing layers on the page. results in different color combinations. But that essentially the advancements that were taking place with this, along with a black tone at times, were allowing people distributing printed books to achieve much more subtle colors in what they were printing and then distributing. The reason this is relevant to Arthur Rackham is that he definitely very overtly and intentionally was experimenting with this. His artwork and his sort of educated tradition out of which he was coming was very, very, very based in ink work, India ink, outline work, which again is something that we see really commonly in a lot of the sort of printed for distribution artwork of this time period. I've covered it loosely in some of my other videos. But Arthur Rackham in particular was known as kind of a master of line work and line-based technique. He also did a lot of silhouette work, I think especially later on, which makes me want to do a video on like Lottie Reiniger and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, one thing at a time. What he would have done then after inking things and making sure that he had his outlines and composition set up and so on is doing watercolor layers over his images. And then the idea being that this could be translated into print because there was now this ability to achieve much more subtle color tones in print workings. This obviously still had its limitations, but this would have been much more freeing. And his work was part of what gave this, to my understanding anyway, it was part of what gave this so much appeal because you could have elements of the narrative being reflected in the mood and coloration of your material, of your illustrations. Now, like I said, I will put links below. There's a really, really cool website that I came across that talks about this in much more technical terms as it kind of developed over time and came out of experimentations in photography. And that website overall is something I'm going to have to get into now because it talks a lot about things like pigments, colorations, dyes, and things like that, which is something I'm interested in kind of separate ways. So what we get coming out of this late Victorian and then very distinctly rooted, or not, maybe not rooted, but situated in this Edwardian atmosphere is storytelling through more easily distributable images with the addition of a much wider color range. Arthur Rackham also experimented with things like movement in his images. Now, as I'm talking, I'm going to start putting images up on the screen. But I would argue that something that makes an Arthur Rackham image really, really distinctive, in addition to his really beautiful pen line work or India ink line work and his colors, is you have color equaling mood. That's the one sort of thing. We have movement. That's a second. And we have playing around with notions of size, proportionality, and the ways in which that situates us within an image, like a room, say, or a field or any kind of setting, but also the way that situates us in the narrative. And I would argue that all of these things are expressed very much, or rather are rooted in expressing narrative, obviously, because he was illustrating for stories or for poems or for ballads or for adaptations of theater productions and so on. So we have, like I said, size, movement, and color and mood. Jeremy Hush's deck, the Hush Tarot, absolutely uses these same techniques, and that's intentional. I'm going to hold up some cards now. Put those aside for a second. Start with here. First of all, this image, as far as I'm concerned, is 100% a direct reference to the illustrations of Undine. But you have here a very, very distinct kind of subtle blue tone in the background of the card. The face of the blonde figure in particular is clearly an Undine reference as far as I'm concerned. And we have here almost a leaning towards each other. There are various narrative elements. The glances that they are giving you are very expressive. And a lot of the motion in this image is expressed through their hair or the sort of directionality of their feathers and their legs, all of which needs to be articulated through the pen work. The colors here are not what's doing the sort of more distinctive storytelling in the sense of movement, but the colors are giving you mood. Another example, we play with images around natural elements like flowers, trees, other things situated out of doors. We play with these things, and we also play with us in relation to them in Arthur Rackham's work in terms of size. And that's reflected in this deck very distinctly. It's talked about in the guidebook. You know, borrowing from these ideas around fairy tales, borrowing from these ideas around the proportionality of fairies and fantasy material, but also keeping everything very, very rooted and grounded and challenging our perceptions about them, which of course is useful for something like the Ten of Swords. Playing with pattern, playing with the line work, and then this yellow kind of subtle, warm, almost parchment color is a very Rackham style color. Another thing that is encapsulated in the way in which Rackham uses these three elements to convey narrative is that the colorations of an image matched with the sort of mood depicted through line work on the very, very distinct faces of childlike figures, for example, is a really, really intense and common theme. And we see that here in this card, Page of Wands. Again, a very, very Rackham color choices here. And we have characters that are in the process of striding forth or moving or standing stalwartly, that's difficult to say, but giving you a very distinctive look. You know, it's begging for interaction, it's begging for question asking, and in the case of the tarot, you are given these elements of narrative more through the cards that you combine together. And then on top of that, your intuitive responses to the image. So tarot itself on any given card could be argued to depend a little bit less on having really, really distinctive narrative pull to it. But I think that's partially because the tarot system works differently than, say, leafing through the pages of a story, in which you are following the narrative of the story, and then it is the illustration's job to make that more evocative and to situate you in it. Other such images we have here, the Four of Cups, which reminds me of certain fairy tales every time I look at it. Donkey skin and so on, cat skin. Really, really dark ones. But again, there's this sort of young person vibe going on, and the sort of emotional fragility, but also strength. There's a separateness here. There's a wish to maybe shapeshift or recede. There's a pensiveness here. There's some quiet here. But it's quiet that's needed. It's necessary. It is, you know, as with the Four of Cups, it's like a seeking of, how would I call it? A seeking of stability, anchoredness in the self. And then the last image I'll show you from the Hush deck, for now anyway, is this one here, where the sort of broken lamplight. First, again, we have that ink work. We have the subtle shift in coloration is what causes this to be very uneasy. The ink work gives us the brokenness. It gives us the texture of the broken glass, the lamppost being very spear-like, obviously, but we also have the sort of curious gestural glance, as it were, very, very motion-filled look of the bird, contrasted with the colors in the background. So the whole point is that you look at this and you have questions. You say, what happened? I feel uneasy. I feel insecure. There is motion happening here. What do I do next? Where is this going? All of which are very Two of Wands kind of questions to be asking. Now, thematically, this is really important in connecting to Rackham's work in particular. And this is intentional on the part of Jeremy Hush. I will link below an interview that I found where he talks about his artwork generally, more generally for a particular exhibition that can be found on OC Art Blog, where they basically interviewed him about some of his work. But he talks a lot about the inspiration behind his art style and the fact that he very purposefully is linking to that notion of being more involved and in place with the world. And I think it's therefore very poignant and interesting that supposedly he makes his own inks and pigments. I couldn't really find a lot more information about that specifically. If anybody has any information on what he does to make his own pigments, other than just sort of using, things like found materials and gum arabic and other such things, I would love to know. But again, I think that's intentional because that links into what we're talking about in terms of stylistic influence and conceptual influence. So Arthur Rackham spent the later part of his life primarily in Sussex in the UK, and a lot of his artwork reflects the landscape of the south of England in particular. A lot of the moodiness, the sort of emphasis on rolling downs or open fields and sort of agricultural settings when outdoors. But he brings with it a kind of a ghostly or uneasy quality, especially as articulated with his really, really intense the silhouettes of trees, the sorts of hidden faces in trees, the sort of element of, yes, whimsical fairy lore, but also sort of spirit of the land, but also in a sense of like neglectedness or some of the more dark and somber aspects of fairy faith, particularly in the UK and that part of the world. So the last thing I'll kind of just come to is that the point with Hush's work is that it is an ongoing engagement with the legacy of Rackham's work. There's an emphasis on, like I said, the sort of folkloric or fairy lore or fairy tale or fantasy-based subject matter, but as rooted in the land, as rooted in the environment around you, as rooted in the insecurity and uneasiness of the Edwardian era leading into World War I and as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And the sort of themes that I see in Rackham's work, that I see in Hush's work as well, are this notion of disappearing landscape and wild, like I said, fairy tales, fairy lore, fantasy, folklore is not necessarily escapist. Hush talks about this in that interview as well, but that it's rooted to some degree or other in reality, that these are real experiences, that there's magic in the mundane, but that also the point is to find the magic in the mundane and then go from there with your imagination on this kind of personal journey. And this again, it's childlike. It is not only for children though. And words that I would again sort of ascribe to these things are ghostly, defiant, expressive of insecurity and doubt, of border crossing, of vulnerability, forward motion in time, and also that sense of the irrevocable march forward of time. So the last thing I'll just mention is that other sort of current to this time period contemporary responses artistically to the legacy of Rackham are, for example, the art of, I believe her name is Emma Martin. I could not find very much information about her, but effectively a few years ago I attended the Sussex Centre for Folklore, Fairytales and Fantasy, which is now named something slightly else, celebrated the 150th anniversary of Arthur Rackham's birthday. And the program basically featured various things, including artistic responses, poetic responses, academic lectures and essays and things about Arthur Rackham's work and the ways in which his work has retained relevance or ways to look at his work and so on. And Emma Martin presented her body of art there and her personal responses, particularly in experimenting again with silhouettes of trees and sketches and things like that, and her sort of more surrealist, very modern aesthetic take on some of the stylistic elements at play in Arthur Rackham's work. So I'll leave what links I was able to find below. I think there's also a podcast that I haven't necessarily listened to, so I don't know if it's relevant, but I found at least 2 links to things that show some of her images that were exhibited in various places. Another thing that happened at that day-long symposium was that the author, Stephen O'Brien, read out a piece of his that he had written in contemplating and learning about Rackham and sort of dwelling with Rackham's work and legacy and so on. That piece has been printed in the London Magazine, and I have excerpts of it here because it was beautiful. It basically explores, it's called A Walk Through Rackham Land, and it explores walking through the Sussex countryside, the modern Sussex countryside, in particular, and linking that back to the environment in which Rackham also would have walked, effectively walking his footsteps, as it were, but making that into a more sort of direct narrative and folkloric experience. So in and about the parts that I'm going to read are peppered references to the sort of architectural or modern advancements in the land in which he's walking, but also emphasis on this very rural setting. So parts of this go. Ideally, if you go into Rackham land, you should go on your own. Take a deep breath and walk. Don't look for Rackham, let him come to you. Walk until the brambles snag your right sleeve and the relish of a cool October wind comes sneaking through the thickets. This will be Rackham's discreet hailing. Take a stick, a crooked one, when you come to Rackham land. A stick for swishing and poking and for pointing. Hold the stick level on 2 fingers and the past and present will be balanced. Rackham is an excellent pathfinder. With his jackdaw's stare, he spied over all the nooks and stooks of the land, and he used them. I start my walk by going through the churchyard and stepping over the gap in the wall that is a kind of stile into a field. This is the threshold. The instant I tread the corn stubble, I am in Rackham land. To my right, there is a metalled road as far as Peppering Farm. I look back along the river. The teeth of Arundel Castle's turrets and chimneys are clean in the autumn sunlight. Across the valley, the steep-ranked trees of Heron's Wood and Offham Hanger is an outlying relic of the Wealden Forest. As the road becomes a loose track, the gravel amplifies my footsteps. Very quickly, it is as if there are 2 pairs of boots climbing slowly up instead of 1. Rackham and I are now going downhill to the river. He shows me how the early October hedges are still busy with birds. There are flicks and skitters at the side of our vision. There is a cross-stitch of industry and mischief. Here a quick black eye shines among the brambles. Here a yellow beak gives an outraged needle cry of territory defended. These are the inklings of Rackham's pixies, goblins, and pucks. The gleeful, pointy little child sprites who hide under the beech tree in Arundel Park. Now Rackham is bent forward a little and intent on his progress. 1, 3, 5, 7 magpies skirt along ahead of us. Bold and canny, they stop to wait for us around every corner. After the cliffs, the climb begins, first on the high Titton Road, then onto the chalk path, colder and colder, up and up, until at some secret cue the magpies burst into flight above our heads. I should mention that it being 1, 3, 5, and 7 magpies is folklorically significant because it's 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy, 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret never to be told. So 1, 3, 5, and 7 are the more uneasy, typically negative folkloric associations there. At last we pitch at his name place, Rackham Hill. I have a long walk back across lowering paths to the car park at Burpham, but it seems that Rackham is going no further. He looks down at the Rackham banks, which are stepped by furrows that were eked by medieval farmers. The bones of his ancestors are in the soil below us. Rackham, the outsider, will stay here, high as a sentinel post. The wind robs the words from my mouth and makes my eyes stream. Here on the cloud-ridden downs and standing alongside Rackham, it is one of those moments described by Stephen Graham. As you lie prone under the trees of the forest or sprawl wet-legged by a mountain stream, the great door that does not look like a door opens. I look round. There is no thin, balding man in gorse-green tweeds and half-moon spectacles. Instead, there stands a crooked hawthorn, torqued twice round himself and warped sideways. Its 2 gnarly branches reach towards Houghton. I walk the quick way home across the open hills, lest I too become a spiny tree-rick, a creeping harp of twigs, through which the wind of Rackham land will whistle the tune of Tan Lin. And all the woods grew dim, and all the woods grew dim. So, that's kind of the point I'm coming to, is that there's reasons these decks are like this. There's reasons that every card is the way it is, that artists know what they're doing. They are picking things, they are doing this so that when we hold a given deck, we are meant to explore too. And fundamentally, that's also why certain sets of colorations and so on remind us of things like fairy tales, make us think of things, we draw these associations ourselves, whether we necessarily are into looking up the origins behind certain things or not. The last thing I'll just say is that I have noticed occasionally that people do seem to respond to this deck with a bit of irritation at times. So for example, with the King of Swords being like a pheasant, I've noticed that occasionally people get frustrated that the King of Swords or any other such similarly significant card in the deck is just an animal. But I think that's the point. The point is that there's references behind this image, that the most sort of thinky or strategic or structured card in the deck, the one that maybe is the best at, supposed to be the best at things like communication and analysis, is an animal, fits very, very well into the themes of Rackham's work. That sense of being rooted in a land that is in uneasy territory itself. There's a shape-shifting happening here. There's a difference of language. And there is, you're being asked, I think, to not only be open-minded, but to shape-shift yourself and to go on that imaginative journey. Okay, I'm gonna stop now. That's all I've got for today. I hope this made some amount of sense. I guess I'll find out. See you guys next time. Bye.